I don't know how many of you may know our speaker today, Amy Yarger. She, you can see that she's been with the Butterfly Pavilion for a long time. What you may not know is that it is not just about the butterflies, and it's not all she does. She's very involved in the community. She does education. She does planning for pollinator corridors and urban planning and policy. She comes to places like Boulder Rotary to speak about not just butterflies, but our invertebrate friends, some of whom I find very scary, but try not to kill out of screaming reflex. What you may not know is that this is the second visit to Boulder Rotary. She was here several months ago speaking to the Preserve Planet Earth Committee. So we want to welcome this amazing speaker. Come on up and we'll get you going. All right, there's your timer. There is your slide advancer.
Well, thank you, Cassidy, and I do appreciate that you don't try to kill all the invertebrates. So I'm so happy to be welcomed by this group today, and I'm so excited to talk about how important invertebrates are. How many of you all have been to Butterfly Pavilion? Just so I could, oh, wow, awesome. So we are an AZA accredited zoo, but we focus on the other 97% of animal species. So if you look at animals, if you ask somebody, what's an animal? They'll say, oh, a dog or a bird. And it's like, well, if you go by the law of averages, actually the right answer should be a beetle, right? That's an animal. And yet, it's so easy to ignore these animals or show fear to these animals. But the entomologist E.O. Wilson once said, basically, I'm just paraphrasing, but if invertebrates were to disappear, humanity could last a matter of weeks because they do so many things for us. So the survival of these animals is pivotal to the survival of humans. And the reason I say that is because invertebrates are found all over the world in every kind of ecosystem. They do a lot of services for us. They manage pests and diseases for us. They help the soil and water to be healthy and clean for us. They make sure that we have agriculture and good food webs and food chains out in the wild. So biodiversity really depends on these animals. And so, part of what we do is show people just how vast the diversity and how amazing these animals are, but then connect them to the importance of these animals so that people can take steps to make the world a better place for them and for us at the same time. So to that end, because biodiversity is a global concern, Butterfly Pavilion works all over the world to engage with communities and to engage with ecosystems in a number of projects. And I'm going to talk just very briefly about some of those exciting projects. One example is our Bees for Elephants project that occurs in Tanzania, where we mitigate human-elephant conflict by using the smallest of creatures, honeybees, right? You wouldn't think that a big animal like an elephant would be afraid of a honeybee, but it turns out that elephants, if they can sense that a bee nest or a beehive is close by, they're less likely to go in and dig up crops or destroy agricultural areas if they are basically guarded by honeybee hives. So it's a great way of benefiting people because people are getting the agricultural benefits as well as the honey and the wax. And they're also having not to figure out what do we do about these elephants? And the elephants are also able to thrive in these areas. We also work on sustainable butterfly farming in Sumatra, where we're working with the community there. And this not only provides a way for people to make a good living supplying zoos with beautiful butterflies, but then helping that rainforest to stay intact because a number of very important and interesting species come from that region. And so, including the Sumatran rhino, and orangutans and things like that. So if we can encourage people to make a living in harmony with the surrounding environment, that's better for people, that's better for wildlife, and we can work with zoos to display some of these stunning butterflies. We also have a project in Mongolia. If you've ever gone hiking and seen our beautiful Rocky Mountain Parnassian butterfly, it looks a little bit like this butterfly that you see on the screen. But we work with researchers in Mongolia to track and record just where these butterflies, how they're doing, how the populations are doing, what the biodiversity is like in these natural areas of Mongolia. So it's so exciting because this is an opportunity that didn't exist before, but we're learning so much. And then, of course, we're part of the globe too, and so we do a lot of work locally as well as globally, whether that's recruiting volunteers to be monitors for butterflies or for dragonflies so we can track how those populations are doing across Colorado, or training people to be restoration master volunteers and help to maintain the health and balance of our natural areas and urban communities. We also have a program called Healthy Habitats where we go into assisted living and memory care centers and grow pollinator habitat as therapeutic horticulture. And then we work with folks in the community to grow native plants to go into habitat around those centers. And that's what we call small gardens, big change. And we do a lot of this in Boulder. And these are actually some residents of Fraser Meadows here in Boulder that are helping us propagate over 1,000 native plants a year through their efforts. The partnership we're really excited about in Boulder, however, is the Cool Boulder initiative, where the city of Boulder is partnering with a number of organizations to really prepare Boulder for thriving as the climate changes. And so what Butterfly Pavilion is working with a number of partners to create biodiversity corridors through the city and to marshal volunteers to take leadership in their own neighborhoods, to talk to their neighbors about putting in pollinator habitat and bird habitat and things like that, and also tracking it, collecting data. As we make these changes, we want to actually be able to measure the impact. So community is really important, and it takes a community to make these large changes to respond to these challenges that we face for biodiversity and climate change. And I'm going to talk in just a few minutes about some of the communities we work with. But right now I want to welcome Janet McFarland-Burlisle, our Vice President of Donor Relations, to talk about where the new Butterfly Pavilion facility will stand in that project.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for having us today. As Amy said, Butterfly Pavilion is preparing for a big move and a future that holds some very exciting things. About 8 years ago, we started looking at our current facility and talking about what our future was holding, and realized that we were running out of space. If you've been there to Butterfly Pavilion recently, you'll notice that our attendance is going up. But all of the things that Amy was talking about in terms of research and conservation and the work that we're doing out in the community became a real driving force for our future and the need to expand. We also quickly realized that our current facility and site would not accommodate our plans for the future. We were really fortunate that the city and county of Broomfield came forward and said, we've got a place we would love for you to be. And they have a new development at Highway 7 or Baseline, which of course runs right out of Boulder, up to I-25. Where McWhinney is developing about 1,100 acres into a new community called Baseline, and they offered us to come up and have a new site there. McWhinney has donated 8 acres for our new facility, and the city and county of Broomfield has committed $13 million to this move. So you can see on this map where we'll be located. And this is the rendering of the new building. We currently are housed in a building that's about 35,000 square feet. The new building we're proposing will be 81,000 square feet, so almost triple our current size. Like I said, we'll sit on 8 acres, and One of the wonderful things about this site is that there'll be off-site parking within the business district at Baseline. So we'll actually be able to program the entire 8 acres, utilizing those outdoor spaces more than we've been able to do in our current facility. A few things I want to point out on the outside of the building that you can see. You can see 2 really large glass houses. The one to the furthest over there, the largest, will be our tropical biome, and that will be home not only to our butterflies, our tropical butterflies, but all sorts of other tropical species that call Butterfly Pavilion home. Additionally, and I know many of you have been to Butterfly Pavilion, it will be 5 stories high. Our current butterfly house is about 1.5 stories, and Amy can attest to the challenges that come with that. We grow all sorts of wonderful tropical plants that really want to grow tall, but our current facility requires that they stay contained, and so Amy and her team go in on probably almost a daily basis to make sure those plants are trimmed back so they don't burst out of the top of the building. And with the 5 stories, we will be able to allow many of those tropical species to get up very tall and create a canopy. Our guests will be able to walk up into that canopy and actually see species that we currently can't have because they want to live up in that canopy. The second part that's under glass will be a desert biome, and that will be home to our favorite friend, Rosie the tarantula, and all of the desert species that we have, plus a few more that we don't currently have. And again, going back to Amy, we don't now have a space where we can have all the wonderful desert plants, and the new biome will allow us to do that. On the far end, you'll see a full-service cafe that will serve both guests to Butterfly Pavilion, but also the whole community and business district at Baseline. We'll have a green roof, and again, lots of outdoor spaces for folks to enjoy and learn more about natural areas in our area. This slide shows you a cut through, and it shows a really nice image of the tropical biome, and you can see how folks will be able to go up into that canopy. And then on the lower level, we'll have our third biome, which will be an ocean biome, where we'll feature all of the wonderful ocean creatures like octopus and sea stars, and there's so many that we can't currently have because we don't have the space, so things like jellies and things like that. We'll also have a new events hall, and I think one of the things that I love about this events hall is that it will actually connect into the tropical biome. So if you have an event at the new Butterfly Pavilion, your guests will actually have the backdrop of all of butterflies and the tropical area to view, and so it won't be quite as removed as our current event space is. These renderings give you an idea of what each of the biomes will look like when they're fully activated. One of the things that we really want to do in this space is not only have those things that are very obvious to our guests, but we want to inspire that sense of discovery and wonder. And so not everything's going to have a big arrow pointing to it. You might be able to look under a log and see some termites under that log, or crawl through a cave and find yourself in an area with glowworms coming down from the ceiling. We want to take a little bit of a page out of our friends at Meow Wolf, how they have a lot of discovery and really encourage that in our guests. You might, in the tropical biome, you might need to look above because the exhibit might be right above your head. Or in the desert biome, as you're walking, look down and you might see scorpions under your feet. We also will be integrating a technology in the new center by using things like virtual reality as a way to immerse our guests in environments or with animals that we can't house. You might be able to put on a VR headset or go into a VR room with a giant squid that obviously we won't be able to have here in Colorado, but are such an important part of the invertebrate populations. And now I want to turn things back over to Amy to talk about the whole development at Baseline and how we will be creating one of the largest pollinator districts. And I would like Amy to tell you a little bit more about what a pollinator district is.
Thank you, Janet. So Butterfly Pavilion, the new location, is going to be at the one end of a 77-acre linear park, which provides a huge opportunity to have connected habitat for pollinators, but other wildlife too. But this is just the beginning of how we're going to work with the community of Baseline to really create something throughout the entire 1,100 acres that is meaningful for biodiversity. And what we're doing is we have a program called the Pollinator District. And what we mean by that is a community that is committed to increasing the amount of pollinators and pollinator habitat over time. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about how generally across the world we're seeing the opposite. But this is a hopeful way of really making an impact and reversing those trends. So not only are we going to see a net gain in pollinators and pollinator habitat, but we also are engaging people around this conservation work. So people are involved, whether they're learning more, they're doing things on their own, they're doing things with groups, they're involved in the community in some way to make sure that we're doing what we can for the planet. So why are pollinators important? You've heard me use the word pollinators a few times today, and I think the first thing that people think about is, well, pollinators pollinate our crops, right? So 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat is because we had a pollinator pollinate that food crop for us. I always say it's the best bite because we're talking chocolate, we're talking coffee, we're talking fruits, we're talking spices, we're talking tea, all those things. Like if you're a caffeine addict or if you like sweets or you like fruit, you're gonna like pollinators. They also pollinate about 3/4 of our native plants. So when you think about those mountain meadows or those coastline, Mediterranean plantings, wherever you go around the world, pollinators make those ecosystems thrive over time. They also are ecological indicators. And what I mean by that is if their populations go down, we know something's wrong. And finally, people like them. If we had a slug pavilion, people might not come, but we have a butterfly pavilion, people like those. So one of the biggest factors, contributing factors to the loss of the decline in pollinators, and we're looking at about 40% of species in North America, pollinator species in North America, are at risk of extinction at this point. So the numbers are dire. And a lot of that is due to habitat loss and habitat disturbance, which make up the vast majority of this graph that you see here. But with a pollinator district, we're seeking to put that habitat back. Because right now, you go to many communities and you see a lot of turf, you see a lot of kind of hardscape. You may not see a lot of habitat, but by doing certain activities, we can put that habitat back no matter where you live. So by getting the right information and doing research, we can identify what pollinators are there and what pollinators could be there. We can train people to make it better for pollinators. We can have partnerships with different groups in the community to mobilize people to action. We can provide design and maintenance guidelines to help people know what to do. And finally, we can educate, whether it's in schools or communities of faith or places like this. So at Baseline, even though Butterfly Pavilion hasn't moved there yet, we already have a presence there because we are guiding all of the planting and landscaping, and we're doing a lot of public programming there already. And so these are some images, and the landscaping really doesn't look foreign or messy, or a lot of people have the fear like, oh, you're going to make habitat now, is it just going to be a big mess? These really are attractive, colorful, happy plantings, and using a lot of native plants that conserve water and do better with our conditions. But what we have found, just in the short time that these landscapes have been there, is we found a tremendous increase in pollinators at this site already. We did our initial survey in 2019, and what we found was very low pollinator populations because it was an old wheat field and didn't have a lot of plants that pollinators need. But after planting the landscape in the portions of Baseline that are developed, we already are seeing types of pollinators that we did not see there before. We're seeing bumblebees at Baseline. We're seeing butterflies at Baseline. And that was something that was not there before. And so that's why I say, if you plant it, they will come. And it just took 3 short years for this to happen. So if you're in a neighborhood or a community, something to always consider is that there are ways for all of us to work together to make things better for pollinators. Whether that's reducing negative impacts like pesticides, or identifying what pollinators are in your area and participating in community science. There are all sorts of ways that people can get involved. And when I was growing up, I saw a lot of movies and cartoons that said, oh, the future is going to be everyone in hover cars and jetpacks and eating pills for food. But that vision of the future is actually pretty old school, and I would argue that the landscapes of the future are going to be landscapes in which we really are in harmony with nature and able to see all of these wonderful creatures and wonderful habitats around us every day for our own health and for the planet's health. So it's really a way to build community, both with us and other species. And with that, I believe we're ready to take some questions. Thank you.
I happened to see yesterday on the news about a bee vaccine, and I didn't get much of the information. I just saw it, but what can you tell me about that?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about it. I am not a beekeeper, but I have done some reading about it. So is anyone in here a beekeeper first? So honeybee keepers have a lot of challenges keeping bees. There are all sorts of things that can go wrong with hives, and one of them is a virus called American foul brood, which is just as nasty as it sounds. And this vaccine was developed by a pharmaceutical company to address that disease specifically in European honeybees. So for folks like commercial beekeepers, this can be very helpful. American foul brood is really bad. Like if it hits your hive, you have to destroy your hive. So it's a bad disease. It is not probably the biggest or most common honeybee disease, but it certainly is something that if a beekeeper, has it, it really impacts them very negatively. So, in terms of the potential impact, it could be very helpful, but it really comes down to the importance of pollinators, the vast diversity of pollinators. It's really not addressing that. The biggest thing we can do is put habitat in for our wild pollinators and for honeybees. That's the most important thing we can do to make the biggest impact for these animals. Yes? Oh, sorry. No, sorry. Yes?
Quick question. How big an area do you need to create a pollinator district or a pollinator community?
So I'll start by saying every little bit counts, whether that's an individual garden all the way to the vast, an entire city. Something that we look for in pollinator habitat is called connectivity. Because if you're a little sweat bee and you're the size of my pinky nail, you maybe fly 400 yards in your entire life. So knowing that you're tiny, you can't fly very far, it's really important to have habitat often enough that the smallest and weakest flying pollinators are able to find additional habitat so they can reproduce and increase their populations. So what I always recommend is, if you are a neighborhood, even a block, and everybody on that block decided to put in a few native plants to support pollinators, that would be huge. What would be huger is getting the next block, or connecting with a park or an open space, or even connecting with the city open space system. So we have a number of programs where we do habitat restoration in urban open spaces with municipal governments, but we also work with like the city of Manitou Springs, for example, to make sure there's pollinator habitat in all the parks. But then we train individuals to go to their neighbors and say, hey, neighbor, come and plant some fun plants with me and we're gonna see more butterflies. So I would say, whatever scale you're thinking of, it's probably going to be helpful.
I have a lavender plant and it's really a bee magnet. What are the other plants that attract the pollinators?
That's a great question, and I may go way over time. No. So a great rule of thumb is you want a variety of plants. So lavender is wonderful for bees, but if you can have something that blooms in the spring, like blue flax or golden banner, those are great spring blooming plants. Golden currant, all the way into summer where you have things like lavender and sunflowers and things like that, all the way into fall with rabbit brush and asters and blue sage. All of those things provide a lot of habitat throughout the whole blooming season. So Butterfly Pavilion does have great handouts that we can send out. So if you like, I can make sure to connect you and make sure that those handouts get shared digitally with entire plant lists. And of course, on our website, www.butterflies.org, you can find a lot of those resources as well.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
A great presentation. I drive by that area a lot. There's a lot of dirt being moved there, but what I didn't catch was when are we breaking ground and when's this thing going to be open?
I'm going to have Janet answer that question. Thank you.
So it's a little bit of a tricky question. So our goal is to break ground in 2025, and it's going to be about an 18-month build-out. However, with the events of the last few years, things have been a little rocky on the development front, and development by land development. And so things have slowed a little bit at Baseline because of the recent interest rate increases and things like that. And so we're actually working really closely with all of the partners, which include the developer, the city and county of Broomfield, and then one partner that I failed to mention is that there is also going to be a K-12 STEM school built by the Adams 12 five-star schools. And so we're working with them as well. And so we're anticipating that we'll have our timelines locked down in the next couple of months so that we can be more certain on when we can actually put a shovel in the ground.
Thanks again for coming to speak with us. I've heard a lot of news stories lately about the effects of climate change and how it's decreased the prevalence of pollinators, how farmers are having to pay for beekeepers to come in and pollinate. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how climate change has affected pollinators in Colorado up to this point and sort of where you see the greatest risk of things going forward.
That's a weighty question. Happy to talk about what we've observed. So pollinators, as you know, rely on flowers for their livelihoods. And what happens with change in climate is you often get a change in what we call phenology, which means the plant's life cycle. So one of the things that you can see as the climate changes is that flowers are blooming earlier, and what that might mean is that the pollinators emerge at the wrong time and their plants are no longer blooming for them, so that can be a challenge. There's also just the sheer challenge of our weather getting more unpredictable. So as we've all experienced, getting those spring storms that are even more dramatic, or those deep fall freezes that, again, will kill off all the plant material all of a sudden in September, when normally we would still have a couple of more weeks of bloom time. So all of those can mean fewer resources for pollinators, and that, coupled with habitat disturbance and destruction because of other activities, put together can really put pollinators at risk. And one of the things that, here in Colorado that we see is that we have a lot of altitude gradients. For anyone here who likes to hike in the mountains, you know how much the habitat changes from when you start from the trailhead all the way to the mountain peak. And as climate changes, what we're seeing is that what used to be the very tippy-top alpine tundra, it's getting warmer up there. And so those alpine tundra plants that have very specific needs, they're kind of running out of space. And so the pollinators that rely on those plants, that's also a huge challenge, just loss of the habitat where those plants can grow. So some of the most important things we can do at this point is make sure that we have diverse and healthy, resource sustainable habitats wherever we can put them, whether that means habitat restoration at high altitude or down here in town, making sure that there are plenty of plants available. We are seeing some pollinators respond by actually moving their habitats. So some of those kind of mid-altitude pollinators are kind of moving up, right? Or the high-altitude pollinators are moving north. So there can be responses in that. And we do foresee that we'll see some adaptations over time, but it all comes down to habitat. And the good news there is that a lot of the steps that we're taking to make pollinator habitat better are actually better for the climate as well. By using native plants, we're sequestering carbon into the soil. And really, with those deep roots that native plants have, we're also using less water, which is going to be a huge concern. And working with Cool Boulder, we're uniting all of these efforts to sequester carbon and increase the tree canopy so that it's shadier and things like that, along with these pollinator habitats that will be better for them as well. So does that answer your question? Yeah, great.
I'm afraid we've run out of time.
Thank you, Meryl.
But it's a wonderful talk, and I appreciate so much you come into Rotary. And, two of the facts that really impressed me working with Amy, not always happy facts, but we've lost 90% of our monarch butterflies. So it is a dire problem. And the other one more interesting is that there are over 900 bee species in Colorado. And most of them, the species do not sting. They go about doing their business with flowers, pollinating. And our PPE committee is actually very involved with the Pollinator Project and the Cool Boulder Project. We're partnering with the Butterfly Pavilion, and we have projects going at area golf courses, at BVSD, and Chautauqua. So find out, if you're interested, find out more. Jim Radowski is the champion. He's very sick at the moment. Please hold him in your hearts. But when he gets better, contact him about it. And so I wanted to thank you for the talk. And the way we always do that at Rotary is with our last word. We have been working for about 40 years to try to eradicate polio around the world. And we're very close, as we always say. And in your honor, we're donating 100 doses of polio vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.